Everyone fled the burning planet, but the alien princess waited for one human. The evacuation orders screamed through every speaker. Explosions bloomed across the horizon like dying stars. Fires tore through the capital, and the sky cracked open with the sound of a collapsing world. Ships rose, thousands of them. Everyone fled. Everyone. Except her. Amid the chaos, the alien princess stood alone at the royal spire, staring toward the ruins of the west gates, because he promised he'd come back for her. And she believed him more than she feared death. The evacuation orders had already echoed through every corridor of the royal citadel by the time the alien princess reached the topmost balcony of the ancient spire. The wind tugging at her silver ceremonial robes, the air thick with the stench of burning stone and melting metal, and below her, the once glorious capital of Kael Shara, the heart of her people's empire, was collapsing under its own weight, choked in smoke, scorched by firestorms and trembling from the tectonic shudders that split open streets and swallowed monuments whole. Her people had fled hours ago, their evacuation fleets rising in disciplined formations into the scarlet-streaked skies, each cruiser carrying thousands of refugees from the devastation that had swept across the continent, a devastation born, not of war alone, but of a dying planet, scarred by centuries of misused technology, poisoned ecosystems, and political sabotage that had finally triggered the seismic chain reactions dooming their world. But she remained, rooted atop the royal tower as the sky darkened with ash, her heart thundering not from fear but anticipation, because she was not waiting for safety, or for power, or for any promise of survival handed down by her council or military advisors. She was waiting for him, the human soldier who had saved her life on the Western Front 3 days earlier, the outsider with tired eyes and a crooked smile, who had pulled her from the wreckage of a shattered command post and carried her through a blizzard of burning debris, who had bled for her when he didn't have to, who had looked her in the eye while they crouched beneath a collapsed wall and promised, in a voice hoarse from smoke and truth, that if everything went to hell, he would come back for her, that no matter how many ships left, no matter how far he had to push through crumbling cities or defy orders, he would return before the last star went dark. And even though logic told her to flee, even though her own guards had physically carried her to the launch pads twice before, she escaped them. She had chosen to believe in that one simple vow more than she believed in statistics or strategy or survival rates, because no one else had ever looked at her as more than a symbol, a pawn, or a liability. But he had seen her, truly seen her, when the world was ending. And that kind of vision was worth more than any royal title. So she waited, alone at the edge of the highest platform, hair tangled by the wind, eyes locked on the horizon as waves of fire rolled across the outer districts, incinerating fields and hangars and homes, the sun itself now a blood-red smear behind the smoke-veiled sky, and every passing minute dragged heavy on her chest. But still she didn't move, didn't flinch when tremors cracked the stone beneath her or when a nearby spire groaned and collapsed in a roaring avalanche of rubble, because all that mattered now was the sound. The unmistakable growl of an atmospheric shuttle cutting low through the choking clouds. And then she saw it. A battered human-made dropship, gray and smoking at the wings, breaking through the storm front like a bullet from the abyss, tilting dangerously close to the scorched rooftops as it dodged flaming debris and collapsing towers, its hull rattling and stuttering as if held together by desperation alone, and her breath caught. Her hands clenched the carved edge of the balcony rail as the ship banked once, twice, then righted itself and surged toward the spire. Its signal, lights blinking in a rhythm she knew, 3 short pulses, their private signal, a code he'd told her during the night they hid in the wreckage, when death had seemed certain, but the stars above them had still felt infinite. 3 blinks for, "I'm here," and as the shuttle hovered barely a meter above the platform, its rear ramp hissing open, her eyes met his through the thick cockpit glass, his face pale, sweat slicked, one hand gripping the controls and the other raised in a wave. And though she couldn't hear him, she knew what he was shouting. "Run!" So she did, sprinting across the scorched stone, heat rising in waves around her, the edges of her robes catching flame as she threw herself onto the ramp, just as the spire groaned again, shifting under its own weight, and the moment her fingers latched onto the steel edge, he engaged the engines with a roar, the ramp beginning to close as the spire behind them finally gave way, collapsing in a howling avalanche of fire and dust and steel, and she rolled into the hold, coughing, gasping, her skin blistered, her lungs screaming, but she was smiling. Smiling because he came back just as he said he would. And he was smiling too, even as alarm screamed across the dash and every warning light blinked red. Because for a moment, against the backdrop of a dying world, they had each other, and it was enough. He didn't ask if she was hurt, and she didn't ask how he made it through the blockade. There wasn't time for questions, only action, as he yelled something over his shoulder, pointing to the harness rig near the wall, and she buckled in, just as another explosion shook the shuttle, one engine stalling for half a second before sputtering back to life, and then they were climbing, barely, through the thick smoke and electrical storms raging above the Capitol, dodging chunks of falling debris the size of buildings, spiraling past evacuation vessels that didn't notice them or didn't care, and she looked back through the viewport, down at the crumbling remains of her city, at the glowing fracture lines ripping through the earth where her ancestors once stood proud and unbroken, and she whispered something in her native tongue, a blessing or perhaps a goodbye, before facing forward again, her hand reaching out, trembling slightly, and finding his, and as their fingers intertwined in the dim light of the rattling cockpit, nothing else mattered, not the fire, not the fear, not even the unknown horrors waiting in orbit or beyond, because he had come back, and she had waited, and in that moment, as stars began to break through the thinning cloud layer, they were no longer just a human and an alien princess. They were the last breath of a broken world, rising into the dark together. The moment they broke through the upper atmosphere, the view turned from choked clouds and blood-hued storms to the silent open black of space, speckled with stars that shimmered cold and indifferent to the chaos below. And the alien princess could feel the pressure in her chest shift, not from gravity or altitude, but from the weight of what they just left behind. The gravity of knowing her world, her palace, her people's history was now no more than a crackling graveyard of molten stone and collapsing infrastructure, and though her skin still burned from the searing heat of the spire's collapse and her throat ached with soot, her mind refused to look back, refused to mourn just yet, because the human beside her, Elias, was flying like a madman, navigating what had once been a bustling orbital lane now thick with refugee debris, wrecked escape pods and the drifting hulks of ships that hadn't made it past the atmospheric tremors, and every few seconds, their shuttle jolted violently as they skimmed too close to a spiraling engine core, or had to bank hard around a burning hulk, and she could see it in his face, jaw clenched, eyes flicking constantly between the cracked view screen and a dying radar system that only worked when it wanted to, that they were not safe yet, not by a long shot, because orbital control was gone. The evacuation fleet had already jumped to FTL range 2 hours ago, and the only ships left behind were crippled, broken, or scavenging the dead, which meant they had no coordinates, no dock, no fuel supply, and no friendly signal pinging back through the void. And as the realization settled into her chest that they were adrift, alone, on the edge of a planetary funeral pyre, her fingers gripped the cold steel of the safety bar tighter, though not out of panic but out of stubborn, bone-deep will to survive. Because she had not waited for him in that tower just to die in orbit, and he had not come back through fire and ash just to burn out here in a drifting tin can, and when he finally spoke, his voice was low and tight and just a little too calm. We've got 30 minutes of burn left before we're gliding dead. And she didn't need to be a pilot to understand the implications. No fuel meant no steering, no braking, no jump. And unless they found a place to dock or a ship to tether to, they'd become another tomb in orbit, just 2 more corpses wrapped in burnt alloy and regret. But before she could ask him what options they had, a burst of static flared across the comms, and then, miraculously, a signal. A weak transponder, ping coming from the far side of the dead moon that orbited her ruined planet, and Elias slammed the thrusters hard, angling them toward the source even as the guidance system protested with angry flickers and error codes, and as they rounded the gray, crater-ridden curve of the moon, she caught sight of the signal's source. A derelict human refueling station, ancient and mostly collapsed, orbiting barely under power, its outer rings scorched and fractured, but one docking arm still extended, flickering dim yellow lights along its length like a distant whisper saying, "Maybe." And neither of them said a word as he brought the shuttle in closer, rotating carefully to align the jagged rear hatch with the docking ring. And for a moment everything was eerily still. No fire, no screaming alarms, just the slow, deliberate hum of a ship trying not to die too quickly. And when the docking clamps finally clanked shut with a juddering hiss and the lights blinked green for pressurization, they exhaled together, the relief sharp and ragged as Elias stood slowly, wincing as blood trickled from a cut above his eyebrow. He hadn't noticed until now, and she stood too, unbuckling herself with stiff, shaking fingers, her body beginning to register the bruises and burns that adrenaline had kept numb until now. But neither paused long. He grabbed a sidearm, she reached for the emergency medkit, and together they moved through the manual hatch into the station, unsure of what they'd find but knowing they didn't have the luxury of choice. And the moment they stepped through the airlock, it was clear the place hadn't been touched by human hands in years. Walls coated in dust, lights flickering. Overhead like broken memories, the stale smell of long-dead filters thick in the air, and yet power still hummed faintly through the floor beneath their boots. Enough to run life support and maybe, just maybe, reroute some fuel. So while Elias made his way toward the central control node, prying open old access panels and muttering curses under his breath, the alien princess explored what had once been a communal living area. Rusted tables, frozen screens, old food packets still half floating in stale gravity fields. And despite the decay, she felt a strange sense of calm, like this forgotten relic of another war, another time, was a kind of neutral ground where species and politics didn't matter anymore, just survival. And when she returned to find him bent over a console with his jacket off, sleeves rolled up, hands deep in a maze of tangled wires and flickering circuits, she saw not just the soldier who had saved her, but the man who refused to let either of them fade quietly into space. And without a word, she knelt beside him, offering the tool he'd been reaching for. And for a few hours they worked in tandem, sweat-slicked, exhausted but driven, rewiring fuel feeds, forcing a recharge into the shuttle's secondary tanks, overriding old biometric locks to access navigation archives that might offer them a path forward. And in the quiet between clicks and sparks they talked, not about politics or titles, or the ruins of Kael Shara, but about the things that made them feel real. She told him about her mother's singing voice, soft and haunting, how it used to lull her to sleep when she was still small and believed the world was fair. He told her about Earth's mountains, how the first time he saw snow, he thought it was magic until it soaked through his boots and made his feet numb. And as the station groaned around them and the lights dimmed again, they shared those small, human details like offerings at the altar of survival. And when at last the fuel transfer was complete, the shuttle recharged just enough to make one more jump, he turned to her and said, "You picked the direction," and her throat tightened, because no one had ever given her a choice before, not like that. Not without agenda or expectation. And she closed her eyes, thought of stars she had never seen, places where no one knew her name, and whispered, coordinates that had once been a bedtime story, a neutral colony far beyond the edge of contested space, where exiles and runaways built new lives from scrap and silence. And he nodded, punched in the numbers, and as they made their way back to the shuttle, she turned one last time, glancing at the control room of the derelict station where they'd carved out just a few more hours of life. And she realized that though everything had burned below them, though her palace was dust and her future uncertain, she had found something rare in the ashes, someone who stayed, who didn't care about her crown, who let her choose. And as the shuttle disengaged and banked toward the stars, she sat in the co-pilot seat, her hand resting on the console beside his. And for the first time since the world began to end, she felt not lost, but found. The jump was rough, not the clean kind that came with well-maintained ships and optimal fuel conditions, but the kind that rattled every bolt in the shuttle and left a metallic taste in the back of their throats as reality reassembled itself around them. And when the static cleared from the viewport and the stars came back into focus, The alien princess saw it, drifting quietly in the shadow of a shattered asteroid belt, hidden from most navigation charts by sheer obscurity and the leftover radiation fields from an old mining war. What looked at first like wreckage turned out to be a living thing. A makeshift colony cobbled together from the hulls of dead ships, ancient modules tethered by heavy cables, solar wings extended like fractured petals, and lights blinking erratically along the outer edges, not in welcome, but in warning, because this was not a place that wanted to be found. And as Elias slowed their approach and pinged a docking request, the console returned nothing but silence, followed by an old analog transmission crackling through the static. Turn back, or you won't turn at all. And still, Elias glanced at her, not waiting for orders, just reading her face. And when she nodded once, he pushed forward, voice steady as he keyed in their clearance code. A fabricated signature from an old diplomatic protocol still embedded in the shuttle's registry. Likely decades expired, but plausible enough to avoid immediate fire. And for a long, breathless moment, nothing happened. Then one of the outer tethers detached, retracting slowly to reveal a docking aperture lined with rust and scorched paint. And as their shuttle slipped inside the belly of the forgotten colony, it felt less like entering a haven and more like being swallowed by something too old and tired to care anymore. And once the pressure equalized and the inner door creaked open, they stepped into a corridor that stank of recycled air, oil, and distrust, lit by flickering panels and patrolled not by guards but by cameras that tracked every step with a hungry stare. And they hadn't taken more than 10 paces before the first voice echoed around them, mechanical and low, female, but flat. Identify yourselves, no lies. And Elias stopped, hands raised, calm as ever, replying with their cover story. Salvage crew caught in the Kale Sharon burn, rerouted to avoid pirate zones carrying no contraband, just survivors. And the silence that followed was heavier than gunfire, stretching too long until a hidden door hissed open and a figure stepped out, tall, wrapped in tattered combat cloth, with a plasma rifle slung across their chest and eyes like flint that scanned both of them before landing squarely on the alien princess with a narrowed squint. And in that instant she felt the familiar tension of being recognized even in exile. Even stripped of her titles and dressed in nothing but a flight-worn jacket and bruises. But instead of kneeling or drawing arms, the stranger just said, "We don't do royalty here," and turned their back, walking deeper into the station with an unspoken command to follow. And they did, weaving through narrow walkways and makeshift halls where humans and aliens alike stared at them with a wariness that felt earned, not cruel, because this colony wasn't built on trust. It was built on desperation, survival, and 1,000 unspoken deals made in the gray space between systems, and when they were led into what passed for a command hub, little more than an old cruiser bridge repurposed with comm towers and power banks, they met the colony's leader, a woman named Merrick who looked like she hadn't slept in a decade, with metal plating in her skull and a voice that crackled like old radio, and she wasted no time on pleasantries. "You can dock here for 72 hours max. After that, we wipe your registry and vent your shuttle unless you pay for berth." And though the threat was real, her eyes betrayed a flicker of curiosity when they lingered on the alien princess, like she was trying to place her some memory, half-formed from diplomatic footage or intercepted broadcasts. But Elias stepped in quick, offering to trade the last of their rations and spare parts for a temporary berth and access to water, and Merrick agreed with a grunt, snapping her fingers at a nearby technician to escort them to a living unit. "No questions. No fights, no propaganda," she added, eyes darting once more to the princess, who said nothing, only nodded, choosing silence over truth. Because here, truth was currency, and she didn't yet know its price. And the unit they were given was cramped, patched together from 2 escape pods welded side by side, with a single bunk and barely enough room to stand. But it was clean, and when the door sealed shut and they were alone again, the silence between them was heavy with fatigue, relief, and something else, something unspoken that had grown in the hours spent flying through hell in the flicker of near-death, in the way they had started finishing each other's work mid-sentence without ever discussing it. And though they didn't talk about it, the closeness hung between them like gravity, unignorable. And as Elias sat back against the cold metal, While rubbing the tiredness from his eyes, she lowered herself beside him, her shoulder brushing his just enough to feel real. And they stayed like that for a while, not needing words, listening to the distant hum of the colony systems as life continued around them in quiet, stubborn defiance of the galaxy's cruelty. And later, when Elias slipped out to barter with a mechanic over the shuttle's oxygen scrubbers, she wandered the interior levels, draped in an old cloak to hide her features, and found herself watching the colony live. Children playing near coolant vents, adults arguing over repair slots, aliens of half a dozen species sitting around repurposed engine parts trading food, and stories. And for the first time in days, she wasn't being watched as a princess, a threat, or a burden. She was just another refugee in a world of them, and the anonymity felt almost holy. But it didn't last long, because as she passed a cracked viewport, she heard her name whispered. Not the one Elias used, but her true one, the one only those who served her house would know. And she turned, sharply. Catching sight of a figure ducking behind a rusted airlock, an instinct overrode caution as she followed, navigating the crumbling halls with quick, quiet steps until she found him. A Kyle Sharon engineer named Tiran, older, his uniform burned and tattered but unmistakably of her court, and when their eyes met, he dropped to one knee, voice trembling. "My lady, you survived." And she rushed forward, pulling him up before his words could echo, silencing him with a hand over his mouth as her heart raced with fear and hope. And after dragging him into a quiet alcove, she demanded answers, how he'd made it, who else was here, what he knew of the others. And he told her in a hushed voice that maybe 24 Kale Sharons had escaped to fringe colonies, scattered and leaderless, hiding from bounty hunters and remnants of the alliance that had betrayed them. And worse still, he said a price had been placed on her head by a faction claiming she'd staged her own death to escape judgment for the war, and that bounty hunters had already started searching systems near the burn zone, looking for signs of a royal survivor. And as the weight of it sank in, she realized this colony wasn't just a temporary refuge. It was a trap waiting to snap closed, because if even one comm slipped, if word spread that she was here, no amount of recycled oxygen would save them. And when she returned to the unit that night, eyes darker, steps heavier, Elias knew something had changed, and she told him everything. About Tyron, about the bounty, about the danger growing with every hour they lingered. And he listened, jaw tightening with quiet fury, before finally saying, "Then we leave before dawn. We don't wait for them to decide whether we're worth sparing." And she nodded, trusting his certainty, his need to keep moving. And together they spent the night preparing in silence, packing supplies, refitting the shuttle with stolen stabilizers and rerouted nav feeds, their hands brushing as they worked, not flinching this time, not avoiding the closeness that had become inevitable. And as the false dawn flickered through the vents and the colony began to stir, they moved together toward the shuttle bay, hearts pounding with the rhythm of flight, not because they feared death, but because this time they had something to lose. They moved through the half-lit corridors like ghosts, not running, but swift and silent, each step calculated, each shadow carefully avoided. And though the alien princess had trained for stealth in palaces and courts where betrayal often wore a smile, this creeping through the skeleton of a dying colony with their lives and secrets packed in a satchel, this was different, because now she wasn't moving alone. And Elias, who had once seemed like nothing more than a tired human with too much stubbornness and not enough sense, had become something else entirely. Not a protector, not even a partner, but a presence, so steady and grounding that she could feel him in every breath, every heartbeat that echoed between her ribs. And as they reached the docking ring, the shuttle already prepped and humming low with borrowed power, the door to the bay began to close on its own, alarmingly early, far before the schedule. And then came the voice, not from the PA this time, but from the shadows above, where Marek stood with half a dozen armed figures flanking her, and her voice was grim but not cruel. "We had a deal. 72 hours. No lies, no attention. And now there's a bounty hunter inbound with scans matching your DNA signature, princess." The word cracked the air like thunder, and Elias stepped forward instantly, blocking the alien princess with his body. But Marek raised a hand to halt her team, not aiming, just watching. Tired eyes blinking slowly as though this betrayal had been inevitable from the moment they stepped through her airlock. "I don't want a war," Marek continued, "and I don't want your death on my hands, but if they find you here, we all burn. So I have two options: turn you in, or let you run and tell myself that's not betrayal, just survival." For a long moment, no one moved, the tension hanging so heavy it seemed to bend the walls inward, and then the alien princess stepped out from behind Elias, not cowering, not begging, but calm and poised in a way that made the entire bay feel smaller. "Let us go," she said, her voice quiet but steady. "And I swear on what's left of my house, I'll make sure this colony is never found again." Marek stared at her, weighing the promise with a soldier's instinct, calculating risk versus gain, until finally she nodded once almost imperceptibly and the guard stepped aside. 72 hours, Marek said again, softer now, more to herself than anyone else. "And you still managed to start a legend." And with that, they ran, not recklessly, but with purpose, boarding the shuttle, sealing the hatch, powering up the engines with fingers that shook slightly only once just before liftoff. And as the docking clamps released and they shot through the narrow exit corridor, alarms began to blare from somewhere far behind, warning of an approaching vessel, a bounty hunter ship long and jagged, its hull gleaming with the promise of pursuit. But Elias didn't look back, didn't hesitate, only punched in coordinates to a slingshot jump around a brown dwarf, a maneuver dangerous enough to make most pilots sweat blood, and the alien princess gripped the console beside him, trusting his hands, his timing, his impossible luck. And then they jumped, the stars smearing across the viewport in long white streaks, the soundless thunder of broken light screaming around them. And when they emerged from the other side, systems screaming in protest, fuel nearly gone and hull scorched by heat, the stars blinked back into place above a quiet moon orbiting a gas giant, an uninhabited backwater used once for mining and long since abandoned. And they drifted silently to its surface, hiding beneath its dusty ridge as the bounty hunter's scanner swept past overhead, missing them by a hair's breadth. They stayed hidden for 2 days, rationing water, repairing the thruster housing with bits of scrap and stubbornness, and in that stillness, something shifted, not in words, but in the way she looked at Elias when he slept in the co-pilot seat, with his head tilted just enough to reveal the fading bruise along his jaw, the one he'd earned back in the cargo bay saving her from a collapsing crate. In the way his hand found hers without question when the cold set in the way they both stopped pretending they were anything but all the other had left. On the third day she asked him quietly, "Do you think we'll always be running?" And he looked at her, tired and honest, and said, "If we are, we'll run smart, together." That word, together, landed heavier than any confession, and neither of them said anything else for a long time. They flew again, hopping from moon to moon, system to system, never staying long, always listening for whispers of danger or rescue. But instead, they found something stranger. Scattered messages encrypted with old royal codes, distress signals, hidden in static, beacons left by survivors of her people, not dead after all, not all of them. And slowly, a picture formed. Kale Sharon wasn't gone. It was scattered, broken, hunted, but not extinguished. Some had joined trade fleets under false names. Others had burrowed into the bureaucracies of fringe worlds. A few had built their own sanctuaries, tiny and hidden, waiting for a sign. And that sign was her. Not the alien princess of parades and diplomacy, but the one who had fled a burning world in a stolen shuttle and survived with nothing but grit and the trust of one human who'd never asked her for anything. Word spread, quietly. Offers came, shelter, ships, allies who remembered the old codes and still believed in the bloodline of stars, and though they never stayed long, she left something behind at each stop, a plan, a whisper, a spark. Elias watched it all unfold with a quiet pride, never stepping into the spotlight, always fixing things in the background, navigation panels, coolant lines, people's faith. And somewhere in that chaos, something deeper grew. Not fast, not dramatic, but inevitable. One night, parked in orbit over a moon with rings like shattered glass, she told him, "You saved me more than once." And he replied, "You let me." They didn't kiss then. They just looked at each other for a long moment, and it was more than enough. Weeks became months. The galaxy shifted. Factions rose and fell. The bounty faded as new wars took the spotlight. And eventually a fleet was born. Not a war fleet, not a royal armada, but a loose thread of ships that answered only to her voice. A whisper across the stars that said, "We're still here." At the center of it all was their ship. Not regal, not large, but home. And one night, drifting in deep space with no enemy on their tail and no fire behind them, Elias turned to her and asked, "If everyone ran from a burning world and only you stayed to wait for one person, why me?" And the alien princess, no longer cloaked in fear or ceremony, answered without hesitation, "Because you didn't see a princess. You saw someone who needed saving, and then you never stopped." He reached for her hand. She didn't let go. And above them, beyond the reach of dying stars and collapsing worlds, the quiet stretch of space opened wide, welcoming not a fugitive royal and a rogue human, but two people who had chosen each other long before either of them had realized it. And far from the fire and the dark, they built something no empire could ever burn again.